Hi, I'm John Blackburn, and this is Entertainment Matters. This is a podcast for people who make live entertainment happen. I talk with people from across entertainment and beyond to explore how we think about our work and how we put that thinking into practice. My guest today is Charles Umney. Charlie is a professor at the University of Leeds, and in this conversation, we discuss his work around AI and its impact on music and creative work, and what Charlie calls politics of value, and how this applies to so much of the difficult bits of our work. Also, as a quick note, much of Charlie's research and work has been specifically focused on musicians. And if you just substitute the word for whatever specific job you do in entertainment I'm sure you'll see how it all applies. Charlie, tell me, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, everyone. Charles Umney. My job title is Professor of International Work and Employment at the University of Leeds. So I'm an academic at the University of Leeds, and I basically research and teach on the subject of sort of digital technological change and the future of work.
Yeah. And I've said this line a few too many times for it to be comfortable actually on this on these podcasts, but full disclosure, Charlie and I know each other because we actually went to Leeds College of Music together and studied jazz. So the reason I'm bringing that up is that you've done a lot of work, haven't you, on this within the sort of music and creative fields, and over the years, we've had bits of conversations and you've done bits of research, which we've talked about. And you've sent me, you've even sent me some of the final things in the papers to kind of look at. And some of them, I actually understood quite a few of the words that were in there.
Good. But they're not hard. It's not like proper science where it's actually like difficult and you have to really learn stuff.
It's not difficult for you, Charlie.
It's like, you've got to, it's because if you're a musician, a lot of the stuff I've written is about working in music, and I did want to write them in a way that, someone who works in music could read and think, yeah, that makes sense. Otherwise, I was thinking, what's the point in doing it? We were at music college together. So I was a saxophone player and wanted to have a career as a jazz musician, but basically wasn't very good.
I don't think that's how that went, Charlie, but carry on.
Well, I definitely didn't work hard enough. That's definitely true. Like I felt like I wanted to do it, but at that stage in my life, I didn't work hard enough to make it a reality. And I ended up getting fed up because there was like this contradiction between, this is what I want to do, but on the other hand, fundamentally, I'm quite a sort of lazy person at this stage. And I don't feel like I'm prepared to put in the work that will be required to actually be a pro jazz musician. And later, I'd say nowadays, I'm quite a hard-working person. I've really changed a lot since then. I'd say I definitely have a sort of work ethic now, but when I was like early 20s, I didn't. And so that whole idea kind of ran aground a bit. But still, made lots of friends, enjoyed it. And as you say, John, a lot of the sort of experiences I had sort of, working on the very lower rungs of kind of live music, were sort of an inspiration for stuff I ended up studying and researching on later as a hardworking academic.
Very nice. We could have an argument, which we won't, about whether or not you were hardworking or hardworking enough at music college, which I would definitely win in opposition to what you just said. But we can save that for another day. So that is kind of what led you to, part of what led you to the work that you do now. And before we sort of move into the main part of our conversation today, which is going to be around the sort of incoming advancements in AI, but we're actually going to really kind of focus on a couple of specific sort of bits of that. And implications of that. But before we move on to that, can you tell us what is a favorite event that you've attended as an audience member? And it could be recent, or it could be years ago, or what's something that you really enjoyed?
Oh shit. Oh fuck. Sorry.
No, that's all right. First of all, swearing's fine. Secondly, editing is possible. I
Um.
probably won't.
Oh god. Okay. This is going to be like a slightly cheating answer. Um.
Perfect.
Because it would be I recently went to see my daughter perform. So my daughter's 13. Um, and she's quite a good musician. So she's working on her grade 7 piano. She's working towards her grade 7 singing.
Right.
Um, and she takes it very seriously. Like, she really pushes herself with it to a much greater extent than I ever did, as I alluded earlier. And she performs as part of like the youth. I think it's called Young Voices, like the youth choir as part of Opera North.
That's amazing.
So every Thursday night we take her to Opera North to do kind of the youth choir there, and they do really good stuff. Like it's high quality. Um, they have really leading sort of conductors. Um, they do really interesting repertoire. The standard of the performance is really high. Um, and so actually that was probably the last live music I went to see, and also I enjoyed it a lot because I was very sort of proud of that she was performing in something that was at such a high standard.
Yeah,
Yeah, there you
that's
go. Okay.
that's fantastic. Yeah, and so Opera North, they're based in Leeds, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that must be incredible actually to have. I'm going to do the small bit of arguing against your lack of work ethic earlier here, but I'll do it subtly so you don't pay too much attention to it. That must be incredible with you having gone so far within music performance, as in a very long way, um,
mm,
to then be able to, because you have an appreciation of what is required to do a thing well. And
yeah,
yeah, and to then be able to see that kind of being expressed again through your daughter. That's wonderful. That's fab. Thanks,
yeah,
Charlie.
yeah, yeah. No, it is. It is. It's really good. Yeah,
Thank you so much. So, the main thing that we're going to talk about today is the impending AI apocalypse. And you sent me a paper that's, I think, to be published fairly soon, which I
yeah,
read. Had to read it a few times to make some notes about it. I think perhaps the difference in this conversation is we're probably not going to be talking about the AI tools themselves in a lot of detail. It's not
yeah.
really
Sure.
about the
Yeah,
tech, is it? What we're probably talking mainly about is what the implications of the tech are on working in live entertainment, being a
yeah,
musician, etc. The main part that I'm really interested in, because I've read some of your previous work, is
mm,
the effect of the AI on basically the labor market
yeah,
within being a musician and working in live entertainment. So the first thing that I picked out of your paper was this idea of the politics of value. Is that a
yeah.
good place to start as a sort of a
Sure.
background? Yeah. So could you talk to us about that? What is the politics of value, and why is it important in the context of AI?
Yeah. So the politics of value. I use this phrase um, basically to mean like quite a concrete set of questions. So, um, should you get paid for doing something? How much should you get paid for doing something? Um, what is too little to get paid? What is too much to get paid? Who should be paying who? Who is owed money in exchange for which service? And how much? These kinds of very concrete questions, and I think these are questions that a lot of musicians like have to deal with um, very frequently. And that's actually a huge part, I think, of learning sort of to be a professional musician is thinking about how you handle these questions. And I can think of an example. I mean, I've done this even myself, like back in the day, where someone will say, "Oh, can you come and play at this event? How much would it be?" And at the time, very inexperienced, reply saying, "Oh, I think it should be this much." Then as soon as you hit send, you think, "Oh my God, that was completely wrong. I've way overcharged them, or I've way undercharged them. I've just got my pricing completely wrong." And then you like email back and say, "No, sorry, that was wrong." Like if musicians at like early career stage have these problems a lot, and I suspect more experienced musicians have to think about them as well, but just in maybe different ways. And so these are really practical questions, and I'm sort of calling them the politics of value because ultimately they are political questions to an extent. Not in the sort of high politics sense of you know if you give this answer you're a reform voter or something, but in the sense that it's about power, and it's about the power relationships between people, you know, whose interests win out over whose interests, you know,
Hmm.
and how do people collectively represent their interests. So yeah, politics of value, the phrase, I mean, just to talk about sort of collective discussion and thinking about what should we be paid for, how much should we be paid, who is the responsibility to pay on, these kind of questions. So the reason that's relevant here, when it comes to AI, is because I was trying to think. So basically, someone asked me, the editors of this kind of edited collection that the article you're talking about is going to be part of. They said, would you be interested in writing like a little sort of short think piece about AI and creative work? And I said, I can, but on two conditions. One is that it can be specifically about music. And two is that it can be very sort of relentlessly negative and pessimistic in tone. And that won't be considered too much of a downer.
And they said,
And
that's exactly what we want, and we've
they
come to
did.
the right guy.
They said that, yeah. That's what they wanted. So, then obviously writing it, I thought I can't just write this saying how the whole thing just about how awful AI is, because you can go to Blue Sky and you can find however much information about how awful AI is as you could ever want, and I do that. I'm often reading Blue Sky, reading, enjoying reading about posts about how awful AI is. But I thought I need to do something other than that in in this chapter. And I thought, okay, what does it really mean in music? Like what? Because music is quite distinctive. Because like AI is often seen as this major threat to people. Like, okay, let's say you're a junior lawyer, right? You've got a law degree, you want to become a lawyer. AI is often seen as like a huge threat for people like that, because like the early career jobs you would get in a law firm are the things that AI can do. So when we talk about the threat of AI to jobs, very often it's like early career jobs in things like the legal profession and accounting, the more routine jobs that don't require sort of specialist experience, and kind of interpersonal knowledge. Now, music's different because music has already, like the legal profession hasn't really had these big technological threats in the same way, right? It's relatively new. If we take that example, it's relatively new for lawyers to be thinking, God, is my job going to be done out of existence by technology? They haven't really had to think about that in the past. Musicians have always had to think about that, so when we're talking about AI and live music in particular, well, we already have recorded music. And as soon as the technology for recorded music comes along, then you could say, well, is live music going to disappear? And however significant AI is, it's not as significant for certainly for live music as just basic recording technology is for live music in the past. So music's really interesting because it's kind of almost already like been there, done that with these kind of problems. Um, and if you read like sort of Martin Cloonan's work on like the history of the Musicians Union in the UK, him and his co-author, they sort of make the comment that actually, if you like the history of the Musicians Union in the UK can be seen almost as this sort of one long battle with technology and like how do we react to technology? The politics of value, you could just as easily apply that to like a DJ, right? If you're in a situation where okay, we're not going to have live band anymore, but we're going to have a DJ. That raises all sorts of questions about the politics of value because it's like, okay, um, is the DJ part of us, if you like? We as musicians, we're advocating for better treatment. Is the DJ included in that? So we're advocating for sort of, MU rate should apply to them as well. Or are they outside of that? And actually our agenda is saying, well, there shouldn't be any DJs. We should be sort of picketing clubs which have DJs. Are they part of that community or not? That's a political question about who has value and who should be paid, who should have access to work. Now, okay, so we fast forward to AI, and the argument in this paper is that, yeah, music's already kind of been there with technological threats, and it always exists. We're not going to lose live music because people value live music, and that isn't going to change. But what happens if you have technologies which essentially are promising to kind of devalue it and change the way in which we perceive music? That seems a very consequential issue to me. Like if we get to a point where, I mean, I suppose we are at a point where, I can generate music through an app. It may be very obvious to like a musician, like it might not be actually, but often it might. Let's say for the sake of argument that it's obvious to a pro musician that this was AI and it's not what you'd expect from like a real musician, but it's not always obvious to everyone. And the question is, what kind of effect does that have on how much we value musician skills? And again, the interesting thing in music is that that's not a new thing at all, is it? Because we know that actually, like, valuing musician skills is like a really sensitive question. And again, especially at like an early career stage, like, even in my own limited experience, you're sort of confronted with the sense that, well, music is a passion. And it's primarily a passion rather than a job. So if I'm giving you a gig, you should be grateful that I'm paying you at all, And often, like, clients might not say that. Often it's musicians themselves, I think, that think that sometimes.
Mm.
You think, actually, I'm doing something I really want to do. I should feel privileged and lucky that I get to be paid to play music. Therefore, you feel like it's hard to talk about how much you should be paid and to have kind of standards around that. And I think AI probably makes that worse, but it's clearly not a new problem.
Yeah, thank you. We are going to continue mainly referring to musicians because music seems to be kind of the front line with each of these technological shifts. We had file sharing first, we had all of that stuff. So
Yeah.
it seems to kind of hit music earlier. But I just want to make the point that everything that we're saying about music and musicians, fundamentally, if it doesn't already, is very shortly going to apply to every single other sort of practitioner within live entertainment. Perhaps it hasn't got to where it's got to in music yet, but video creation,
Yeah.
you want it to look like you've got 10 dancers on stage, big video wall. Not the same, but It's this question of who gets to define professional.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
could you talk to me about that a bit? So that idea of, yeah, who gets to define professional and how that could change, or it, maybe even just how the definition professional might change, and also that idea of, I guess it's linked in with that idea of kind of good enough, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So just to go like back a moment to the thing you said earlier as well about um, music almost as a sort of vanguard. So what happens in music can be generalized, and often music is kind of at the front line of a lot of things. That's really interesting, and it makes me think of what sort of certainly up to a couple of years ago was this massive buzzwords talking about the economy and the labor market, which was the gig economy, right? Um, and those of us who'd studied music were sort of hearing constantly about, oh, there's this new thing called the gig economy. We go, hang on, gig is a music word. That's a music thing. Um, so there was an argument at the time that actually is this almost like the kind of musicification of the wider economy. Now, actually, that was quite overblown because a I mean, we don't even talk so much about the gig economy now. We've sort of moved on to AI as like the next big thing. But also, music is very distinctive as well. There's so much that goes on in music that you can't just say applies to other places. So it is more complicated, but it's really interesting actually that the way music is kind of sort of yeah, on the edge of these things. This is a really important question, I think. And again, the whole politics of value thing, it is also about, okay, what do we deserve to be paid? And when you say, what do we deserve to be paid? Who is we? So again, like historically, you could talk about the sort of DJ, and say, well, okay, are they part of the we whose jobs and whose pay we should be protecting? Or are they a sort of threat on the outside? So these kind of questions never go away, and they come back, but often in different ways. And I think, opens a huge can of worms about this. And I mean, there's so many examples, a lot of which you'll be much more familiar with than me, I'm sure. But we could think about, let's think about like musicians, for instance, who promote music generation apps, which obviously does happen. There's sort of high profile musicians who've kind of, I guess, must be getting a lot of promotion money for promoting whatever, AI music apps. This has been really controversial, right? And again, I feel like you know more about this than me, but I'm sure, like within the music scene, and I'm aware that within the music scene, there's like a lot of backlash against, people who would sort of taking money from Suno or whoever it is, and that again, that's a question of sort of professional politics, isn't it? It's because it's about, some people might say, actually, this stuff is devaluing what we do. How can we ensure that musicians can like make a claim to be paid properly? Well, the only way you can do that is by saying we are doing something that other people can't do. Like it's the same in my job, like in academia, like how can we defend ourselves and sort of say that we have the right to be paid properly and to have job security? Well, in order to sort of make that argument, we have to say, well, this is what we do that technology can't do. Because someone might come along and say, hang on, I can just get ChatGPT to write me a whole series of lectures about artificial intelligence and the future of work. Why do I need to pay money to come to the university in Leeds and listen to him do it? We have to find ways of saying this is why we're important. And musicians like have always had to do that. And I think it's kind of, maybe it's quite sort of galling for musicians to sort of then say, well, here's an app that can do what you do, because there's all sorts of reasons why it sucks to hear that. Um, but one of the most sort of direct material reasons is that, well, this could make it harder for us to make a claim for why we should be paid, and why we should like be seen as workers rather than just people doing a hobby or a passion. So there's a real there's a question that kind of musicians have to sort of sort out for themselves, which is like, how do we respond to it? Um, is it that we say, actually, AI is just shit, and if you're listening to AI music, you suck. You're kind of missing out on actual, like, real music. You're not understanding what is good about music, what makes it sort of special. Um, no, I will say that is actually my view. So I do think that's true. Um, but practically, that's hard. Um, and you end up with a lot of kind of fragmentation, because what you might end up then is you could end up with a sort of polarization, if you like, where you have kind of scenes which are like, I was thinking like, like sort of organic dairy products, where you say, this milk was made on a farm where all the cows were fed on the best quality grass, and
They
that kind of
could roam
organic.
the countryside.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
and it's like, well, okay, this music was made by real humans
Fed
without
on the
any.
best grass.
Exactly. Without yeah, without any artificial nonsense, without any apps, without any sort of covert plagiarism. You know, it's all stuff that people have worked over for decades to learn how to play, and are playing it, as in a very human and kind of organic way. You will have like live music scenes that really have that attitude, and people will go. People like probably quite affluent people, like your sort of elite, cool kind of jazz followers and stuff, will probably pay a lot of money to go and see that. Um, And then outside, you might have a sort of Wild West where um, here's like the low value section of the market where, it's full of slop, basically. Um, so you've got to be sort of prepared for those dynamics. Otherwise, it becomes a question of saying, how can we use this properly? Like, can we have a framework for um, how these kind of tools could be used in a non-exploitative way, and in a way which maintains the value of musicians' work? And it's hard to think exactly what that would look like in music, but there's examples from other contexts, isn't there? Like, if you think about, like, there was a strike recently by like video game actors, essentially looking to sort of find a framework for how can how can we sort of enclose the use of AI in a way which actually not necessarily benefits us, but is less damaging to us?
And haven't there been a few examples that have been sort of in the press as well on like the book authoring, writing side of things, because of
Yeah,
the prevalence of like LLMs? I think there was someone, there's been a few of those. I think it was a couple of examples of authors that did extremely well, like had a big fan base, like, and were self-published.
yeah,
And then they got picked up by a big publishing company
yeah,
and paid a big
yeah, yeah,
advance. And when they went through the manuscript, uh, it wasn't completely written by an AI, but it was
yeah,
heavily written by AI. And of course, interestingly, there has been a reaction against, I would say the main color of the reaction has been
yeah,
negative to that news.
yeah, yeah. Like, really, and sometimes really quite an aggressive, angry backlash against it.
Mm. And it
Wh
sorry, it makes me I sort of wonder if is it going to be a bit like the 70s with like as disco got more and more processed, suddenly we kind of got well, maybe it's not the 70s, but we kind of got punk, didn't we?
Yeah,
Which went kind of the opposite way. It was no longer about the values of the music were no longer about the sort of quantized perfection or whatever. And
yeah,
it thing there was an opposite reaction, wasn't there? Like I suppose
yeah,
previously, what's the one that they talk about at music school a lot? It's like the reactions against Wagner or something, isn't it? Here's all
yeah,
these anyway. Yeah. Is
yeah,
that
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of what you think maybe is on the way?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because yeah, you're right, like, okay, f the first thing, books which have been subsequently retracted because of AI use. This is obviously a really dysfunctional situation. And it makes you think, actually, what is the future going to be here? Have we just got now a future basically forever where loads of books are going to be released and then subsequently there's going to be a scandal because there's found AI usage, and then people will react against it, um, and they'll be retracted on one hand. On the other hand, you will have people who basically are unashamed of it, right? There are people who, write a book a day, sell them on Amazon, make a lot of money from doing it. Um, and they don't care because they don't necessarily their self-image isn't in I'm a real author, if you like.
Mhm.
And the people who buy it probably don't massively care either. They think, okay, it's entertaining. I don't care if it's AI or not. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with the bifurcation thing. Where you'll have like a split because on one hand you will have a sort of, we're talking about books here, right, rather than music, but you can apply this to music as well. You'll have a more sort of cool, artistically engaged, authentic literary scene where there's a massive stigma about AI. If you use it or people think you used it, you're going to get sent to Coventry. Your name's going to be dirt. And then there'll be this pool of, pejoratively, people would say kind of AI slot, but let's say, okay, a much more kind of mass market AI assisted,
I was going to say influenced, but that was
AI
lovely. Assisted
influence,
is great.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
where basically people don't really care about that kind of authenticity in the same way, but they're willing to pay money for, just like a quick novel to read. So that we could have that kind of divide, and what that would mean, I don't know. That's kind of crystal ball gazing, but that is something that we have to start thinking about. Well, if that situation arises, how would we handle it? Because I mean, there's obviously problems with that. There are obviously all sorts of problems. Not least because even in your sort of more authentic scenes, there's always a lot of like power imbalances, cliques, inequality, lack of transparency. If you read, like, again, think of that to music college, philosophers like Adorno,
Mhm.
the idea of authenticity, I'm authentic, what I'm doing is an authentic experience, is really dodgy, because who gets to decide what's authentic and what isn't? Who gets to decide who gets sort of pilloried for using AI and who doesn't? Well, there's all sorts of inequalities in that process. So that to me is quite a dark future of this kind of polarized landscape. But I think it's one of the possible futures for like working in the arts. Maybe one of the darker ones, I guess.
And this might quite nicely help us sort of pivot into talking more about platforms. There was that memo or that email that got leaked, wasn't there, from I think it was like someone very high up at Spotify
Oh
to their
yeah, 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 yeah,
counterpart at Suno.
yeah.
Now I'm going to get some of these details wrong, but you'll get the gist. And it was the idea was this: there'd been this big meeting where Suno had basically said, or maybe it wasn't even Suno, maybe it was just one of those
Yeah.
apps, had basically said, "Oh, well, soon our danger to your business, Suno to Spotify, is people aren't going to come to your background playlists. They're going to come to Suno and they're going to say, I want this, this, and this, and this. Make me an hour's worth of music,' and it
Yeah.
will go Bing. So it won't even
Yeah.
be the AI picking algorithm in Spotify satisfying
Yeah.
people's very precise personal requirements for the music in that moment. It will be literally music uh, composed is the wrong word, isn't it? Generated. Music might even be the wrong word. Sound
Yeah.
generated in that moment specifically for that person. And obviously in the meeting, there'd been some to and fro about how likely this was to happen. And then the lady from Spotify, I think, had basically written this memo back and said, "Oh, actually, I I used Suno to do this exactly as I was cooking tonight, and it was incredible. And yes, you're correct. This is the future." And and it would definitely be a conversation for another day, and also a conversation that everyone's having anyway. But the fact that in order for Suno or whatever to generate that music in the first place, it had to illegally plagiarize existing works to do it, and there was no
Yeah.
compensation for that. Yada yada yada.
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy, isn't it?
It is, and there's so many responses to that. And there's obviously, like, on one level, there's like a very basic sort of emotional response, which is to say, well, actually, the lady from Spotify, it seems like they don't actually really like music.
That's clear,
Um,
isn't it? Yeah,
yeah, and you can say, well, actually, one of the reasons music is good is because it's communication. It is a human being creating something for another human being to listen to. Um, if it's not being created by a human, doesn't matter what it sounds like. I mean, this is my view, certainly. If it's not being created by a human, it doesn't matter what it sounds like, because I'm not really interested in listening to it, because I see music as a form of communication between humans. She obviously doesn't see it that way. But then saying that, I don't know. I think it is important to say that, because that is part of how you can, reinforce the sort of politics of value in music, by actually making a case for why human generated music matters. So it absolutely is really important to make that case. But there's also the point I was making before about, there also has to be thought about how you can bring in, like, a framework for using this stuff in a way that doesn't hurt musicians, or which at least minimizes the damage to musicians. So that could be, for instance, talking about sort of compensation and copyright. It's very difficult. I mean, with the video game example, it's things like, well, how can, I need to retain some of the rights over anything generated using my voice, or things like that. So yeah, I think it's a very murky situation, and there's many different levels to it. And one level is just the sort of really basic, we have to make a case for why music is valuable when it's made by humans. But on the other, you can't you can't just completely say, well, AI is junk, because you'll always have those other market segments, where people don't really care about that. Like with the books, that you can have a big group of people that says, we hate AI, we're only going to buy real organic books. But then you're also going to have another pole where that isn't the case at all. And you have to be thinking, okay, how can people in that area get a good deal? And yeah, I don't have an answer to what that would mean, but it means basically, collective voice, collective bargaining. Um, it's an uphill struggle without a more favorable sort of, policy infrastructure as well, because we know that UK governments are relatively hostile to the interests of creators in relation to AI. They seem more inclined to kind of take the AI firms sides in those disputes, which really sucks. But ultimately, that's the only way things can get better is if, yeah, you have this bigger view where it's not just about kind of reasserting the value of human-made stuff. That is important, but it's not everything, and that will only ever be like a partial response to the situation, because you'll always have people like the Spotify lady who don't really get that, and there's always going to be musicians who rely on, getting on like a background playlist. Obviously, that's easier said than done.
Do you know what it reminds me of, actually? I do want to move us to talking about uh, the role of platforms and algorithms, which of course is still a bit of AI, but maybe an earlier
Yeah,
incarnation of it in a second. But the whole thing actually reminds me a bit of, when you and I were at college and we were
yeah,
working on whatever, we might make jokes about music. And that was a thing
yeah,
from like the 80s, wasn't it? That
yeah,
idea of, it's like, well, it's not music, is it? It's the thing that you did on your sequencer for the lift.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and it's similar but more difficult than that, because of course the oh god, what do they say about it? The creation process, I'm doing in air quotes, the
yeah,
creation process is being democratized.
yes,
But and the other thing it made me think of is, I'm pretty sure I've got this right. There's a Miles Davis quote, isn't there, where he heard some like young jazz students playing and he says something like, well, it sounds like jazz. And I feel
yeah,
like that's maybe similar with the AI stuff. Like, it
yeah,
sounds like music, but it's not music, because music is made by a person for another person.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, music's a really interesting example. And again, coming back to the politics of value, because, um, don't music creators deserve to be paid for the music they create as well, right? You know, um, that's a question that, yeah, musicians have to think about. Yeah, like is it just, well, someone just like pressing a button on their synth to do the work of what like a five-piece band would do? Yeah, on one level, that's actually quite bad for musicians. But then at the same time, you have to come to terms with it, and you have to say, well, okay, yeah, that sucks, but the music person should be paid for what they do as well, right? Because it's in all of our interests, to say, well, actually, even if it is music, you still have to have sort of standards in the industry that that are held up and applied. And so then the stuff about platforms and democratization then becomes really complicated. So like actually I'd say probably the main research project I actually did in live music, because the AI stuff is basically just sort of me thinking a bit off the top of my head, right? It's not really research, it's just thinking. Where we actually did research was around the role of sort of platforms and kind of digitalized intermediaries in live music.
Great. Perfect. And I remember thinking a lot about that
Yeah,
with the bits that you fed me and what we talked about. So let's switch into that
yeah,
completely now. Um, and we've still got a bit of this value, haven't we? Because now we're talking about who gets to assert the value, aren't we?
exactly.
So talk
So
to me about
yeah,
that. Yeah.
so this was something I did a few years ago, like just pre-COVID. So, and I haven't sort of revisited it in a research sense since. So it could be that some of what I'm saying is going to be a bit dated. So your audience can listen and think whether I'm out of the loop or not. But we were doing research a few years ago, looking at kind of live musicians' experiences and looking at the role of kind of digitalized intermediaries within that.
Right. Hang on.
Um, yeah.
Digitalized intermediaries.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's like an agency website.
Yeah. Exactly. Compare two people. Both of them want a band for their wedding. One of them might say, "Okay, never heard of the internet. Don't know what Google is, but I know someone who knows someone who's a musician. So I'm going to ask them to put me in touch with them. I'm going to ask them how much it would be for them to sort of come and play at my wedding, something like that." And then another person who's like, okay, I need someone to play at my wedding. I'm going to Google it. Jazz band wedding Leeds. into
I've done
Google.
that recently, actually, and your face is the first one it's an old photo, but your picture's the first one that comes
No,
up. Yeah.
God, people wouldn't like that. No. And then you'll get like what is essentially some of these sites. They call themselves platforms, but they're really not platforms in the way that like Uber is a platform or like a social media platform is a platform. They're basically um, like online phone directories almost. So you say, okay, series of drop-down menus. I'm looking for a band within 50 miles of Leeds, playing whatever country music. Here's my budget, and you can search and you can say, okay, here's 200 hits, and you can order the hits in terms of price potentially, or even like customer rating. So that's really interesting, and because it raises these very big questions about the politics of value again, because one those sites do two things at least at the same time. One is actually, yes, it's democratizing because anyone can join. Some of the sites, they will have like some basic sort of quality control, but it's a lot more open to join. And you can say, well, actually, when it was sort of based on word of mouth networks, let's say, there was one guy who was getting all the gigs because they were sort of, they had the big name, they were popular, they kind of sewed everything up. Now it's democratic because actually I can be listed alongside of them. They can listen to a sample of my music alongside a sample of their music and decide. So it is opening in that sense. Of course, what it also means is in the paper we talk about like discipline. It's disciplining because it essentially, it puts downward pressure on prices. Because if you can order musicians in terms of price, there's obviously a massive incentive to be the cheapest band, obviously. So they're democratizing, and at the same time, they create the possibility for intensified price competition among musicians. And that makes it harder to say, okay, well, there's ME rates. Musicians Union said I shouldn't work for less than X amount, otherwise I'm undercutting like standards in the profession. But how can you maintain that if you're on a site where you can be ordered in terms of price, and whoever's at the bottom is going to be the one who gets the job offers, or they're at least going to appear first to anyone who orders it in order of price. So yeah, politics of value. How do you maintain like norms around fair pricing in that context? Again, I don't really have the answer, but I'm sort of, just trying to talk about the questions. I mean, one thing that always occurred to us was, why doesn't the Musicians Union have a site like that where
I would imagine there are multiple reasons that the MU doesn't have a site like that.
yeah, I'm sure there's very good reasons as well, and they probably
There's
think
probably some very good ones as well. Absolutely, yeah.
who's this guy telling us what we should do? That's ridiculous. Doesn't he know how difficult it is to have that kind of site? Sure. But, could you have some kind of way of organizing that kind of site which is better for musicians and which is stricter about like minimum prices and things like that? Maybe they exist, like I said, it's several years since I actually really did proper research on this topic. So it could be that they do exist now, which would be great. I don't know.
So this is all great, Charlie. Thank you so much. Typically, when people in entertainment, musicians and beyond, and in fact, beyond entertainment, talk about the threat of AI, we talk about it mainly from the perspective of the threat to the creative bit, but actually, it sounds like actually the biggest effect might be on that sort of not not having your activity replaced by AI, but actually just having your sort of bargaining power
Yeah.
financially massively weakened.
Yeah, yeah, and I suppose again, that's not a new thing for musicians, is it? Because there's so many things that have happened, including the example I just gave of sort of more kind of digitalized intermediation, which is a potential threat to the bargaining power of musicians. That's the other thing that's worth mentioning here is I've got a PhD student that I supervise, um, whose work isn't really published yet, but once he starts publishing, I'm going to be really sort of sharing this quite widely. Who is looking at these kind of questions among like graphic designers and sort of visual artists, and he sort of talks about people relate to AI in very different ways, and that to an extent depends on your sort of market position. So if you've got kind of a reputation and you're sort of doing relatively kind of high value work, um, you could have a client who gives you sort of autonomy to organize the work how you want. You can essentially retain all the creative process, but maybe you use AI on a leash. So there's the boring bit that I find tiresome to do. I can get AI to do that, but the actual interesting creative stuff, I'm going to be all kind of I'm going to be the one making the decisions. Then in contrast, you've got other people who maybe don't have a reputation. They've got less kind of power, influence in the marketplace. They're competing for relatively sort of shittier jobs, where it's kind of quite quick. Here's a bit of money. I want you to do this really quickly. Hurry up, kind of thing. And they might be using AI as like, shit, do it for me. So actually, it's not really a creative process on their part. They're basically just saying, okay, I don't have time to think about this creatively. Chat GPT or whatever it is, do it for me. So the relationship between the creative worker and the tools they're using could also become very different, you
Mm.
know? And again, that goes back to the point before about the kind of bifurcation, dualization of the market, where you'll have some people who either don't use AI at all and make a selling point of not using it whatsoever, or people who are still kind of giving their own vision, but they treat it as a tool. It does the easy bits for me while I do the interesting things. And then on the other hand, people who are just like churning out, and actually it's AI which is being quote unquote creative. Obviously, we know
Yeah,
it's not creativity; it's
generative.
synthesizing other people's creativity, but it's the AI which is deciding what the product looks like. So that's another aspect to this is people like to say AI is a tool, which I suppose it is, but it's a very, very complicated kind of tool which has differences to other tools because like how how you use it could like vary so significantly. So if we take something like a hammer, which is really the kind of most basic of all tools, right? If you're a carpenter, you're using a hammer, you could be engaging in a really creative process. You're imagining everything, you're designing it, you're thinking, how's this going to work? What's going to happen? How am I going to do it? And the hammer basically does stuff that you physically can't do, like pushing in nails. Um, but it does exactly what you're telling it to do. You know, I've got this nail, I want it to go into that bit of wood, the tool will do it. AI can sometimes be like that. Sometimes, you know, it could be that you say, okay, um, I've been writing an article. I'm going to give an academic example. I've had all the ideas. I've planned out the structure. The writing style is my style. But putting in all the references at the end uh, is a bit of a pain in the arse, and I'm going to get the AI to do it. Now, okay, the AI might screw that up and get me into a lot of trouble.
For example.
That's a separate issue.
Yeah.
The fact is, I'm defining clearly a kind of non-creative, specific thing that I want it to do. So in that case, yeah, it's like a tool. But that's not always the case with AI, and it's often not the case. Um, it's like, actually, if you have your hammer and you hit a nail with it, but you've got absolutely no idea what's going to happen. You know, it could actually hit a different nail, it could pull the nail out, it could do something completely different. A lot of the time, AI usage can be like that. And in academia, again, we have the sort of sharp end of that, because you have students using AI. They don't really know what's going to come out. They don't have the ability necessarily to judge whether what's come out is good or not. And they end up getting in a lot of trouble. AI is quite complicated just as a tool. It's not just a tool to help you achieve things. It can actually take over and define what you're doing in ways that you're not in control of. And the difference often is to do with sort of market power. Are you at the sort of top end of the market with your own reputation? If so, then you've got more power, more agency to integrate AI under your control. Or are you churning stuff out as fast as you can on short deadlines for relatively low sums of money? Like, I guess, fabricating stuff for a background playlist. Then it's not a tool. It's basically doing the creation for you. It's creating something that's not under your control.
Yes, and the way I've been, obviously it's not a complete answer, because it's going to take somebody more like yourself who's actually spending their time really thinking about it. But I sort of put it down like the hammer can't decide how hard to hit the nail or what nail to hit.
Yeah.
You do it. A tool in that sense is one step removed from your activity, whereas
Yeah.
AI can be like that, as you've said. Whereas AI actually is, if we think of creativity, it's not the only definition, but as fundamentally is decision making.
Yeah.
Like that as one way to describe what creativity is. It is decision making. Well, if you're no longer making those decisions, you are no longer the one, and I think that is a dividing line, isn't it, between how we regard AI as a tool.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. And that's I mean, there's a few people talking about that now, but the reason it's sort of in my mind is because Eunice, my PhD student, is looking at this and finding out like really, really interesting stuff in relation to that with kind of graphic designers, like Turkish graphic designers. So that's probably someone whose work I'll be promoting and shouting about in maybe a year or two's time. And then, of course, that feeds back into the politics of value, because those questions which we started with, who should get paid, how much, why, who pays, they get really muddied if you're sort of losing control of the creative process.
Thank you, Charlie. You've given us a lot of real depth on what some of the upcoming challenges are that we need to sort of grapple with, and maybe we could do with grappling with them a little bit quicker, whether that's, influencing people to perhaps come up with some framework for all this stuff, making decisions ourselves about what we think within the sorts of entertainment and creative world. What kinds of conversations do we need to be having between ourselves?
Yeah.
And what sort of things can we be doing to try and have a good outcome for us and for what we do?
Collective work of voice matters. I really think ultimately that's the only answer, is that you have to have collective work of voice. In other words, people who work in these industries have to be working collectively to ensure that they're able to negotiate and have a say in how these situations pan out. That has to happen at multiple levels. And you have to, we need various things to happen at the same time. So on one level, there's kind of the level of like the public discussion. One thing which I think is really interesting and maybe is actually like a source of hope for me is that a lot of people think AI is quite shit, and from what I hear, it's not uncommon for like kids, for instance, to sort of say like, oh, that's AI as a means of saying that's shit. Um, and I think to me that seems like quite a good development for creative workers, and something that should be encouraged. So,
Do you mean
because
specifically the swearing amongst children, or yeah,
like, as sweary as possible, yeah.
yeah, good.
Because again, politics of value, it helps make a case for why what you're doing is special and not shit. So that's one thing. You've got to have these arguments in circulation. They've got to be visible. But there's another level which has to go on as well, which is more pragmatic, which is you have to be saying, okay, we're trying to sort of stigmatize AI a bit in the public eye. That's helpful. That could involve saying all sorts of things about how terrible it is. At the same time, we've got to be thinking, how can we create a framework that's going to mitigate the damage of this? And, I find it very hard to see beyond things like copyright in that process, you know? But it fundamentally requires a different attitude among government. But ultimately it's about setting down rules for, if you have to use this stuff, how can we make sure that we're using it as a tool where the worker is in control of the process and is in control of the output. So we have this. So I'm the editor of a journal. You start to think, actually, I really wish people just wouldn't submit AI stuff to the journal. Like I just don't want it. I don't want to read it. I'd rather you just didn't send anything written with AI to the journal. But obviously, that's not the end of the issue, because a lot of the time I might not be able to tell. So it's just not sustainable for me to say, well, there's no AI here. That's just not possible. So you say, okay, we need a system of rules. We can allow it. You can sort of sign a declaration when you submit saying, okay, I've used it for specific limited things like, whatever, completing my reference list or doing like sorting out the formatting, where I'm in control of the process. It's my work. I'm just using it as a tool. That defines what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And then you also define, well, what are the punishments if you're doing stuff that isn't acceptable? You can't submit to the journal again, for example, something like that. You have to sort of be doing two things at the same time. You have to be, okay, publicly, you need to get the idea in circulation that AI isn't very good and that a lot of what it claims to be able to do is a bit inflated, certainly in like creative professions. And even if it is very impressive, it's just not really creativity. That argument is important. But at the same time, there needs to be this sort of process of thinking, how could this be used in the way where it is a tool under our control and where we're retaining some of the sort of value from it? And that's really hard. That requires policy change at government level. It requires significant sort of collective worker voice. And I don't really know, I say genuinely, I don't really know where sort of creative worker unions are on this. I don't mean in a sort of rhetorical, where are they? What are they doing? Not in that kind of way, genuinely, because I've not been researching it for a while. I genuinely don't know. So it could be that they actually do have a really good response to this. So anyone listening, I'd say, well, you should go and find out what they're doing about it and judge whether you think it's adequate. Because ultimately, yeah, workers having collective voice is the only way you can deal with this. It's hard, yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Charlie, because actually that is like a very direct, super practical thing, isn't it? It is important. If you realize it's important, probably contact Equity or go on, at least get on the website to whichever union you're a member of and actually
Yeah.
see what they're saying about it and think about it.
Do you know what's the MU saying about it? Do you know? I mean, you'll know more about that than me.
Well, embarrassingly, Charlie, no, I don't, but I should do,
Yeah.
and I'll go and have a look at it. But maybe
Yeah.
I can sort of tag it on to the end of this. I'll certainly find wherever they
Yeah.
talk about it and put a link in so people can go and have a look. The funny thing about that as well, I suppose, is actually it, sort of as we sort of move to kind of wrap this up a little bit, that what you were just saying there about sort of collective bargain, collective conversation and worker voice
Yeah.
does bring us back a little bit to what we talked about at the very start again, doesn't it? Which is this idea of one of the challenges whether it's musicians or other performers or other creatives, all of us, we're all in the same boat with this one, because one of the challenges we're going to have is that the semi-pro section of our community and all of the brilliant things that you said earlier about it, sort of including them in the thing, that's going to be another challenge for us, isn't it? Because not only have you got, as you put it, the upper end and the lower end of the market that will have different opinions and requirements for use of AI.
Yeah.
We then within the creative world have that upper end of market, lower end of market, semi-professional / amateur end of the market who still might get booked to do a wedding gig or whatever.
So just by way of wrapping up then, that is something that has always seemed quite unique about music to me. That's one reason why I don't think you can just say, oh, well, music is like the forerunner of what's going to happen everywhere else, because it's actually relatively unusual that you have a sort of such a big pool of like semi-pro, enthusiastic sort of amateur hobbyists. But so historically, you would have, like, what would a musicians union do? Well, if you look at like classic, like the height of musicians trade unionism in the US, for instance, well, the musicians union, the AFM, could be saying, sorry, you're not a union member, you're not a professional musician, therefore you can't play here, get out, which actually from today's kind of vantage point just sounds like a really weird situation, because it's so hard to imagine like the MU doing that now. It couldn't do that. I mean, it would be illegal for one thing, actually, to do that. Right. But that has been a day-to-day reality in the past, within living memory for some people. So whenever I think, whenever I think, oh, I'm talking about how worker collective voice should resolve these issues, and then I think that's stupid, like how kind of utopian ridiculous it is to just say that. You think, actually, no, within living memory, there have been times where musicians' unions have enforced minimum standards and have restricted, okay, you can be passionate about music, you can be sort of partially a musician, but if you're playing in a public space, in a job that musicians would want to do, you have to be a union member, you have to be paid a certain amount. Otherwise, you're essentially in trouble. That is living memory for some people. And it would be, we're not going to get back to that point in our lifetimes, I don't think, without very major sort of national political change, because even like legally, you can't do that. But we've just got to be thinking about how can we reinvent new ways of having that kind of collective strength. And I don't know exactly what that would involve, but it will involve people thinking about these things. The necessary condition for anything like that is that when people think about music, they think about value, and they think, what is this worth If I'm going to play music, I need to think about the politics of value. I need to think about what is it right for me to play for and what isn't it right. What responsibility do I have for other musicians who are also trying to make a living from this profession? Um, so that's why, yeah, it is. There has to be like a collective conversation that shapes how people think about these things. Um, So it's at the forefront of people's minds, these kind of questions about the politics of value. If it is, then something will happen. And I don't know what it will be at all, can't predict that, but something will happen.
Mm.
If you have this kind of attitudinal shift where actually the vast majority of live musicians are thinking about how much should I charge? What is it fair to charge? What's a fair rate? What's my responsibility to the wider profession? The more people think about that, the more likely there is to be some kind of change. But we don't know what it is or if we'll get there.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Charlie. And uh, and before we go, if there was one question that that you wish I'd asked you, or that we had agreed I'd asked you and I've forgotten, what would that be?
The only thing that's really quite kind of funny to me actually is the whole discussion about passion, because it really interested me that, like, the Suno people, for instance, if they sort of explain why is their product good, what
Oh,
basically is the case for it? Why is it good? Their answer is, well, it helps people who have a passion for music to realize that passion. And I thought that was really funny, because the whole point, this is going to sound quite conservative and elitist of me a little bit, but the whole point of having a passion for something is that you've got to be prepared to work hard at it. That's the whole point of being passionate about something. If you don't want to work hard at something, you're not passionate about it. Going back to me as a jazz musician, right? I feel like I actually wasn't as passionate about it as I thought I was, because I wasn't really that prepared to work hard at it. So that side of things is just quite funny to me. But
there's even something, isn't there,
yeah,
in where the word passion, I can't remember what it is, I'll have to look it up, but there's something
yeah,
about even what the lineage of the word passion is itself.
yeah.
And I'm sure it's something to do with the word toil or something like that.
Probably. That needs a
Yeah.
a different type of podcast to work that one
Yeah.
out. But
Yeah. One
but
that I
yeah,
am not equipped to produce at this stage.
well, yeah,
That
you can't have passion. Well, the Passion of the Christ is
that's a
about
different kind of podcast,
how
Charlie.
horrible it was, wasn't
Yeah.
it? It's
Yeah.
not about him thinking, "Oh, I'm creating a really nice mythology on ChatGPT."
That-
It's about suffering.
the passion of the
Um,
that would have been a much shorter film, wouldn't it,
yeah,
if it had been about
it's like yeah, it's about so, a final word then is it's about saying, actually, being really good at music is something that people have suffered for. It's not just something that you can say, "Oh, I've got an app, now I'm really good at music."
yeah.
That is wrong, and that's not
And the
passion.
same.
Anyway, yeah,
No, no, no. Thank you. And the same across the board to all of our sort of other performer and creative friends. We're all in the
yeah,
same boat here. It's coming for everybody.
yeah,
I've mentioned and you've mentioned a couple of the other bits of research that you've done that I've really enjoyed reading, and I'm
yeah.
sure I'll come back to. Where is a good place for people to go um, if they want to find some links to some of the work that you've done, or just kind of read more about your thinking?
Oh. Um, God, I'm not very social media. So it will probably be actually my, Google Scholar page, almost.
Great, great. That
That
sounds
that that is
perfect.
just a list of everything I've written that you can go through and follow, and most of it should be open access, so you shouldn't have to pay hundreds of pounds to an academic publisher that will rip you off to read it. If you find anything that you'd like to read that isn't open access, you can email me and we'll find a way around it. So yeah, my
Thank
email
you.
is publicly available. If you just Google my name, you'll find my university webpage. you'll find my email address. You can contact me and say, "Oh, I really wanted to read this, but I couldn't," and I will find some kind of solution.
Some workaround. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoops. Charlie, thank you so much. I'll get those links from you. I'll put them in the show notes so it's really easy for people. That was
Cool.
absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much,
Good.
Charlie Umney.
Cheers, Ron.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for whatever you do to make live entertainment happen. If you'd like to be notified when there's a new episode and stay up to date with the podcast, you can sign up for the Entertainment Matters Cue Sheet at the link in the description. Have a great show.